Finland. My name is John Kettle. I'm a director in the Institute, and it's my pleasure to host the this presentation this afternoon. Thrilled that you could all be here to join us for this presentation or lecture, but before we begin, please note that this lecture session will be recorded. Following the lecture, I will have a discussion with the speaker, who you've all virtually met briefly already, David. And after that, there will be the floor will be open to questions from the audience, and of course, questions taken from the chat too. So please be active in the chat as we go through the lecture and also the discussion. So today's webinar is entitled Finding the Nexus Between Water, Energy and Food Security in the Arctic. And we are honoured to have with us Dr. David Natcher, a distinguished researcher and professor from the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. Dr. Natcher is a renowned expert in the field of Indigenous resource management and sustainable development in the Arctic. He specialises in economic and environmental anthropology and questions of land use and resource management in the Arctic and subarctic North America. He currently holds a University of the Arctic Research Chair in Water, Energy and Food (WEF) Security in the Arctic. He has made significant contributions to our understanding of the complex relationships between Indigenous communities and natural resources. Today, Dr. Natcher will share his insights from the recent work on water, energy, food nexus in the Arctic, highlighting the unique challenges and opportunities for sustainable development in this critical region. We look forward to an engaging discussion on this timely and important topic, and for David at a very, very early hour of 7 a.m. and I'm sure for others too, a very early time. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. I know 7 a.m. isn't that early, but as you're trying to navigate Teams, it feels incredibly early to me. I'm really thrilled to have been invited to share some of the work that we're doing. I should say at the outset, while I'm happy to speak with everyone this morning, the work that I'll be sharing is really being led by a large international team, multidisciplinary, Indigenous organizations, and I'm happy to present this work on their behalf. And I'll do my best to answer any questions that folks might have. So before I get going, Nora, is there my apologies for not being IT savvy this morning. Is there a way to fully display the screen? But if that's
are you seeing the presenter notes yourself, or for us it looks, at least to me, it looks fine. There's since you're sharing the PowerPoint, you can see the black frame, but that's, to me, it looks very good.
Okay, as long as it looks good to you guys, that's most important.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. So what I thought I'd do today is present some of the work that we're doing with the Sustainable Development Working Group around water, energy, food security in the Arctic, and I hope you find it interesting in that I've opted for breadth over depth this morning or this afternoon, and but I'm really happy to return to any of the slides that I'll be presenting if you want to hear more about specific projects that we're involved with. And I've organized the presentation around the notions of nexus thinking and nexus doing, and some of the work that we're doing in those two realms of the WEF security nexus. So almost entirely all my work has focused on the North American Arctic. I've taught at the University of Alaska a few years, Memorial University in Newfoundland, and have been at the University of Saskatchewan since 2007. and my work is in the boreal and the North American Arctic. And I'm not sure how many North Americans are on the call today, but the insecurity in WEF systems is at a crisis proportion in North America. And I know, fortunately, that those conditions differ dramatically than in Finland and Norway and Sweden. But in North America, Arctic communities are struggling with basic services in accessing water, energy, and food systems. A lot of the communities I work with do not know what it is to not be under a boil water advisory. So I know people in their early 20s who have never not boiled water in preparation for food or consumption. Deliveries are overly dependent on truck systems or distribution points in the communities. And with the cascading impacts of climate change, these already decaying infrastructure and communities are made that much more vulnerable to providing water services. Energy is very much the same, where in northern Canada, Alaska, there's virtually no grid connectivity, which results in an over-reliance on imported energy, most often diesel, which has high costs, both social, economic, and environmental, and it leaves communities quite vulnerable when key infrastructure is affected, which I'll talk a little bit about today, and its impact on other services. Food security is probably relatively more known to others outside North America, and that it's been highlighted by the United Nations, and pointing out that Canada ranks first among industrialized nations for Indigenous communities who experience food insecurity. Not a position that Canada is really happy to have received. Places like Alaska, 95% of the food that's consumed in Alaska is imported from the south at a roughly $2 billion annually. Poor quality of food due to long transportation systems, and really limited and seasonal variability in this. So the three of those systems, the water, energy, food, are incredibly vulnerable in the north, and by all accounts are getting worse as climate change affects these key distribution points and the service delivery of WEF systems. Now, these systems, I've always just focused on food. My research for the past 20 years has been around Arctic food systems, and particularly the food insecurity of Indigenous communities. But you simply can't treat one sector as a siloed a service without considering the others. And as you get more into community food systems in the Arctic, they're being made vulnerable by the limited water availability, energy services, and to treat one in isolation of the others often compounds those insecurities in those sectors rather than improvement. And often the best efforts of government and communities often result in unforeseen challenges or these wicked problems. For example, right now in northern Canada and Alaska, communities are increasingly adopting containerized agricultural production systems, these hydroponic systems. And there's an example on the screen of one system that's really popular in northern Canada. And the idea of growing food in the north is wonderful. If you can lessen your dependence on imported foods from the south, that's a really positive outcome, and that food independence and food sovereignty. But if you lack sufficient access to clean water, reliable water, energy systems that need to be trucked to these containerized systems, the chances of failure are being made that much greater. And that's what we're seeing in the north. While containerized growing food systems are fantastic in theory, when water has to be transported to those systems on a daily basis after treatment, and diesel fuel has to be used to support the energy requirements of those, they're really susceptible to failure. And in many cases, after an investment of $500,000 to $1 million Canadian, we're seeing many of these systems abandoned. And the communities I work with, one's using them to store office furniture, another is using them to store hunting equipment. So without considering the trade-offs around these systems, one, positive growing food, but the negatives around energy and water availability, they're really made vulnerable to being sustained. The other, and I think this is probably something that you two are seeing in Finland and certainly Norway and Sweden, where the transition to green energy again is a very positive outcome. Communities would love to lessen their dependence on diesel energy sources, but at what cost are these transitions occurring? For example, I'm not sure if you could make it out on the screen, but this is a picture taken from a friend of mine whose trap line was made the home of a wind farm, and areas that he had used for generations to hunt moose and trap fur bears now was made, his access was excluded because of this energy transition that was promoted by the province of British Columbia. Again, a wonderful move towards greening the energy system and sectors, but at the loss of Indigenous livelihoods and the ability to find and procure food for his family and others in the community. So again, those trade-offs. And I just I included this quote from Gun-Britt Redder. The green shift is nothing more than a continued extraction of resources in Sami areas. The difference is that resource utilization has been given a nice green color green. We call it green colonization. And we're seeing the same kind of pushbacks in parts of Canada, where Indigenous people once again feel victims to these transitions. So understanding those trade-offs. And that was really the motivation for a project that we were supported from the Arctic Council back in 2021, 2022, that wanted to better understand and consider this nexus between water, energy, and food insecurity in the Arctic, and one that explicitly includes Indigenous livelihoods and rights within that nexus. So it was an idea of we have to abandon this siloed approach to fixing specific sector challenges and start thinking about these as nested systems and with complex interactions between them all. Easier said than done. And we received funding from the Arctic Council, the nation states, particularly Canada, US, and Norway, as well as the Indigenous permanent participants on the Sustainable Development Working Group. So what I thought I'd do is talk about how we've gone about taking on this project and our approaches to both WEF Nexus thinking and WEX Nexus doing. And that thinking involves understanding that these systems are complex. There's a heck of a lot of uncertainty, and most often outcomes will be wicked in nature, in that you think you solved one problem and you created two more for you. So there's an acceptance of those challenges when you begin this road of nexus thinking in WEF systems. The other side of this was this notion of nexus doing, and I'll show a couple of examples of what we're doing in trying to achieve these place-based solutions to address water, energy, food insecurity. The critical aspect of participation of both governments, industry, and Indigenous peoples, and arriving at appropriate technologies that could to alleviate some of these insecurities without imposing high capital and technological demands on communities. So that's how I thought I would organize next few slides in what we're doing around nexus thinking and nexus doing. So on my screen, this is very, very tiny font, and you might not be able to see it, but one of the first things we did was we developed in collaboration with Martin Olson in the Faroe Islands was a graduate course, an open access graduate course in WEF Nexus in the Arctic. And last year was our first delivery. I delivered it here at the University of Saskatchewan, and I hope moving forward it will be available through the University of the Arctic. And we're focusing specifically on post-secondary graduate level training where students are introduced to the history and evolution of the WEF Nexus. It's not too young, but it's been around for a while, and talking about the different theories and methods as a way to get students who may go off to industry or academia thinking about these interactions between these systems. And in addition to focusing on that kind of evolution of theoretical developments and methodological developments, both qualitative and quantitative modeling, we've focused on two specific case studies. One looking at the Yukon River Basin that bisects Alaska and goes into Yukon, Canada, and looking at some of the institutional challenges of trying to manage these systems. And the institutional redundancies that challenge effective management and just actual communication between stakeholders and tribes and indigenous organizations. And how do you navigate that complex administrative and bureaucratic environment and stay nimble enough to manage these complex WEF systems? The other half of this course was focusing on a water crisis in Iqaluit, and how a crisis in their water system led to a number of cascading impacts that affected food security, energy security, healthcare provisioning, and a lot of distrust in local governments, and looking at points of potential intervention that could have been made to alleviate these conditions during this crisis. So the class is organized around theoretical, methodological developments, then grounded into real-world case studies. That's a way to get students, graduate students, thinking more critically about the WEF Nexus. The other is the development of a serious game. And as a cultural anthropologist, this was very, very new to me, but I found it incredibly exciting, and it's being led by a colleague at the University of British Columbia. And if you're not familiar with serious games, as I was not up until a few years ago, it's not for entertainment purposes, although we hope that there is an entertainment value in these. It's more about problem solving, educating. And in this case, an Arctic WEF Nexus serious game is being developed towards identifying challenges in the Arctic that players can begin to explore how to achieve a more sustainable nexus between these systems, promoting synergies between these systems and reducing the trade-offs involved. So, for example, two different games are being developed. They're both single and multiplayer applications. One is players have the opportunity to develop an Arctic community from the ground up. And they have they're challenged to identify energy sources, identify where you're going to get your water from, how it's going to be treated, food systems, self-contained, imported from the south, all these decisions that have to be made in designing this community, and players are rewarded in that process when more synergies, for example, between water and energy systems are established, and points are deducted when there are certain trade-offs. Do you put strain on certain systems if you make a certain decision, like agricultural development at the expense of wildlife harvesting, or impact on water resources? The other is a transboundary basin management game where two countries are involved, and you have to make decisions about how those shared resources are going to be allocated in an equitable way without one country placing additional burdens on downstream communities or downstream country. So that's another way we're trying to get, decision makers, students, people, in the Arctic thinking more about, the nexus between these systems, hopefully in a fun and kind of informative way. So I'm excited to see where this one goes, and I'm learning far more than I'm contributing to this process from my colleagues at UNBC. The last, or almost last, way we're approaching nexus thinking is we've developed an online portal, and you're free to visit this anytime you'd like. And this is includes a dashboard where people can come and see different resources that were made available around Arctic WEF systems, publications, presentations, videos that we've made. We also include data on the Arctic nations, their achievement of sustainable development goals relating to water, energy, and food, to SDG 2, 6, and 7, current status of where Arctic nations are in achieving those SDGs in relation to water, energy, and food. And you may not be able to make it out on the screen, but there's different applications where you can go into Finland and see where they're making advancements in all those SDGs, as well as other indicators that are being used to measure water, energy, food security. You also have an application to enter your own data for a community or a region to arrive at a composite score to measure your own WEF security. And there's instructions and applications of how users can use that and use their own data to measure their own systems. That system includes an opportunity for what we're just calling a WEF security decision support tool, where users, policymakers, community leaders can enter their own data and run various scenarios on how improvements in one sector would affect the other WEF systems. For example, if how agricultural expansion in the Northwest Territories can lead to greater improvements in food security. Well, you can run scenarios to see what demands that'll be could potentially be placed on water resources or energy resources. So it's an opportunity to kind of play within this system to, again, thinking about how one action actually facilitates or contributes to those unanticipated consequences in WEF systems. And obviously no scenario is going to be a perfect demonstration of what will happen, but by running these different scenarios, and okay, if we choose course A, what will be the outcomes, will be the cascading effects of this decision. And it gets, hopefully it allows decision makers and policy planners to think more forward and thinking about the outcomes of some of their actions. And it just, again, promotes that nexus thinking. So those are some of the activities that we're involved with nexus thinking. And again, getting people to think about the complexity of these systems rather than fixing a problem within one specific silo. That the WEF nexus has always been, I think, recognized as a really useful conceptual device, where people say, yeah, it's really great to think about these systems and as complex systems and the need for taking into account those interactions. But how do you translate that into actual doing? And that's been one of the real criticisms of the WEF nexus. It really has yet to evolve beyond that conceptual value. And, in reading a lot of the literature, I too often agree. But what we've tried to do is actually do this idea of WEF nexus doing. And one of the first things we've done is looked at regional WEF security in the Arctic. So globally, Arctic nations are among the top 12 most WEF secure nations of the world. Iceland being number one. I think Finland in 2023 was ranked, I want to say, ninth. And all the Arctic nations rank quite high in the global WEF security assessments. What we did was we wanted to look more carefully at regional WEF security, because what happens, particularly in Arctic regions, is because of the dispersed and small populations of the Arctic, much of that data gets, when it amalgamated, is obscured in those national reporting. So while Canada, for example, ranks third globally in WEF security, well, we know conditions in the Arctic are very, very different. So using those same 21 indicators that are used in the global WEF security assessment, we analyzed 27 Arctic regions, including 3 from Finland, and I'm not sure if you can make that out on the screen, to look at how regional variability may differ from those national reportings. And you can see in Canada and Alaska, where Canada and the United States rank really high in WEF security. Everyone has really good access and availability to WEF resources. In northern regions, the conditions are dramatically different. And again, those figures hopefully demonstrate some of that variability between the regions. Nunavut, for example, 60% of the population being food insecure, vastly different than southern Canada. Same with Alaska in their scores for food availability. Finland, you could see that some Arctic regions are actually doing better than national reporting, and that's a very positive, where investments and resources have been made available to those Arctic regions, allowing them to be far even more WEF secure than the national reporting. But why this was done is we wanted to demonstrate that variability and ideally inform policymakers for more targeted interventions. So rather than promoting this positive narrative of regional sustainability, identify where certain regions in the Arctic, say, for example, the north slope of Alaska, where they may be lagging and where specific interventions may be required to improve those conditions. So we developed this as a roadmap for policymakers to begin thinking about what policies, what strategies could be put in place to target specific regions of the Arctic to improve their WEF security. So that's one activity that we thought was valuable for this Nexus doing. The others, and I looked at this slide, and I apologize, I know it's a very complicated and busy slide, but we are working in the Peace River Basin, and the Peace River Basin that flows through Yukon, British Columbia, and Alberta and Northwest Territories, when combined with the Athabasca River Basin, is the largest river basin in North America. And the Peace River has most recently put their third large hydroelectric development on the river. The first was put in the 80s. And these hydroelectric facilities are being promoted as a way to provide energy to the growing industrial economy of British Columbia and Alberta, particularly for energy development, oil and gas. But the impacts have been dramatic, both for the loss of agricultural land, the loss of hunting land by First Nations, and also the contamination of water resources through the loading of mercury and other contaminants. So while it's been very positive, or potentially very positive, for energy production, it has had a number of negative impacts for First Nations and other land users that are downstream from these hydroelectric facilities. So what we're doing as a sub-project within this Arctic WEF Nexus project is to work with all stakeholders to begin to think about how we can modify the different flow regimes that could actually mimic natural seasonal conditions. So, for example, First Nations that we work with want higher volumes of flow in the spring and summer months so they can access hunting areas and be out on the land and using the river as a transportation corridor. Right now, that's when a lot of the water is held back, which really reduces the opportunity for First Nations to utilize the area. Also, that holdback has led to an increased contaminant load in the river, where we're looking to periodic flushes of that system could potentially lead to a more healthy river ecosystem, fish that can now be consumed, wetlands that could be replenished. So this has involved a multi-stakeholder collaboration, sincere engagement by all to date, where people are starting to think more critically and sophisticated ways of modifying the impacts of this hydroelectric facility that will allow for other values to be derived from food systems and water systems downstreams from these dams. The next case study and sub-project we're doing, we're linking water, energy, food to forest ecosystems. And this is being done in collaboration with the International Model Forest, who I've worked with for a number of years. And we have a case study in Canada, the Prince Albert Model Forest, as well as case studies in Guatemala and Chile. And I joke with my wife that I think every Arctic researcher I've known, as they age, they end up finishing their career in places like Chile and Costa Rica. And I'm not there yet, but we're spending a time in Guatemala and in Chile trying to understand how model forests can be better managed to meet the water, energy, food needs of local communities. Whether that's in the design of forestry operations, whether that's the design of riparian areas, greater buffers around forested areas. But again, this is being approached through a really collaborative way where stakeholders, industry, government are coming together to think about how these forest ecosystems could be managed in a way to better meet those WEF needs of communities. And in addition, each of these three study areas, Guatemala, Chile, and Canada, are increasingly susceptible to large-scale wildfires. In Western Canada, it's become just the norm of the summer season to have intensive wildfires. So taking into account the anticipated impacts of climate change going forward, can we begin to think about forest management in a way that kind of buffers or mitigates some of those potential impacts of wildfire, reducing fuel loads or other strategies while trying to meet those WEF needs of communities involved? And again, to date, it's been wonderfully productive, where people seem sincerely excited about thinking about this and then actually putting that into management plans for their forestry operations. As I said before, I'm one of many people on this project, and the Sustainable Development Working Group has been just wonderfully supportive of this work and excited to contribute to it. University of Arctic has also facilitated communication between their theme areas, whether that's the renewable energies or food security, and just enhancing the community of scholars and practitioners who are committed to this WEF nexus thinking. And you'll see that the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland has been very instrumental in this. Umeå, Faroe Islands, Iceland, as well as, and this has been very key to our success so far, the involvement of the Indigenous permanent participants, particularly the Arctic Athabasca Council, Inuit Circumpolar Council, and the Aleut International Association. Without their leadership and direction, yeah, this would have been a real challenge, and continually remind us that these WEF systems cannot be disconnected from Indigenous livelihoods and rights. So keeping us in check to make sure whatever we do in regards to nexus thinking or nexus doing reflects those Indigenous rights and the livelihoods of Arctic peoples in general. So this network of folks, it's been exciting, and that's why I love doing brief presentations like this, because I'm always very keen to expand this network of nexus thinkers and begin thinking about things I've never even thought of. So I extended invitation to anyone online today. If this is something that you're interested in or think you might be able to contribute to, I would hope that you'd feel free to reach out to me. And I see I promise to keep this as short as I possibly can. I probably rambled more than I intended, but I'll conclude there, and I hope that I can answer any questions that people might have. And again, I just want to thank John and the organizers for inviting me to contribute today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David. I mean, it's a very impressive presentation you put together for us, and I think I can honestly say that to be able to perform this presentation at this time of day for you is fantastic. Thanks. And I think honestly you've done the network proud, let's put it that way. But the idea now, whilst you catch your breath and drink some coffee or whatever, is that we have like a small discussion between you and I, and then we open up the floor to questions. So please, whilst we are talking, I really do not mind if you use the chat and you wish to pose some even more tricky questions to David, or even just the easy questions. Now is a great time to ask him. So yeah, if we go back to your presentation, I mean, you took us on quite a journey, and I think the images you showed at the start were quite stark, related to the Indigenous perspectives on the WEF security. And I think maybe living in Helsinki as I do, I'm not so aware of these issues as I should be. But how do you think we could better integrate Indigenous knowledge and rights into the WEF nexus research and policy making in the Arctic? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, the way we've approached it, and certainly the way we've done it in the other research that we're doing, it's less about integrating Indigenous knowledge into this, and more about the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the process.
Right.
So I think too often, certainly here in Canada, we try to just simply integrate knowledge or input from Indigenous peoples at the expense of their genuine engagement in the process. So where I could go, and that one slide that I showed of that wind turbine on a friend of mine's trap line and hunting territory, I could go and then write about the impact on my friend and his family. But it's far more effective to have him and leaders of his community involved and say, we're not opposed to wind energy, but we want to be involved in the placement of that. And we may not put it in the heart of Joe's trap line. We may find alternative arrangements, or thinking more critically about how these wind fields can actually be designed in a way that don't necessarily exclude Indigenous access and use of those areas. Again, no Indigenous community I work with is opposed to renewable energy. However, how it is imposed on them and how it affects their livelihoods is fundamental to this conflict. So I think in the way we've approached it, and I think working with the Indigenous permanent participants for the SDWG has created a kind of a forum that allows for the engagement of Indigenous peoples rather than just the inclusion of their knowledge.
No, I think that's a really good answer. I maybe naively thought that the knowledge came with the people rather than as separate, but it's a very important distinction you made there, and I think so. Would you agree that there is definitely a role then for example, Indigenous-led research initiatives in advancing this WEF nexus? I mean, we're bringing the network in here, but there's even more scope going forward in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the projects that have recently come out of this work is taking a critical eye at the sustainable development goals through an Indigenous lens. And right now, the Indigenous permanent participants on this project are taking the lead on a new project to develop more relevant and culturally reflective sustainable development goals and indicators for the post 2030 agenda. So they're looking at the indicators that are used to measure water, energy, food security in their territories, and realize that these really do not reflect the realities and lived experiences of our communities, and what new indicators can be better developed to really reflect those conditions. So you're seeing this, in our case, Indigenous organizations taking ownership of this process and advancing their own forms of self-determined development and sustainability. And to me, that's very exciting to watch happen.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, definitely. And I was just thinking to myself that, if we want to be able to get this balance right in the sustainable development and respecting Indigenous rights, who better to actually be able to do this, to be honest? I think it has to be all together.
Agreed.
And them taking the lead. I also was really struck by that quote that I guess struck you as well about green colonization. It's such a powerful phrase. I mean, now this is where I didn't expect. I just have to answer the door. Hold on one moment. I do apologize. Hold on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No worries. No, and maybe I'll just I think I know where John was going, and we're seeing that. And again, I think it's largely because the notion of green colonization has really emerged. Particularly, I know it's been an issue in Finland, Norway, and Sweden, but you're seeing it more and more in Canada, where these interventions are seen more often as being imposed from Ottawa or Washington, D.C. on Indigenous communities without understanding kind of the local needs and context. Like I said, I don't think any community that I work with would oppose green energy, and they're eager to get away from the dependence on diesel energy sources. But if that involves the displacement of their territorial use and undermining their ability to actually procure a livelihood from wildlife resources, that's not a step they're willing to take. You create, one intervention creates these ripple effects or these cascading impacts on other systems. And that's, I think, is the real opposition among, and I don't want to be speaking for Indigenous peoples here, but again, when they don't feel part of the process and feel that these decisions are being made at their exclusion and are being imposed, that's where the tension kind of is experienced.
Well, thank you, David, for covering so nicely. Apologies to everybody. I knew I was expecting a FedEx delivery today. I just didn't realize that it would be Murphy's Law that they would turn up right now. There is one. I can see one hand raised now. Would you like to ask your question? I'm sorry, I only see initials. So please go ahead.
Hi, hello, I'm Eva Pongras from the University of Oulu. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. As you described, perhaps the food security aspect is not so pronounced in where I am from, but what I do worry exactly this energy sprawl, this kind of green colonization. However, I'm also worried a little bit that perhaps some of the sentiments fly too optimistically. I don't know if you have seen examples or elements of that we kind of managed to sell it so well that this is so good. This is so good for everybody because it is going to bring jobs. And I did also a discourse analysis, particularly on hydrogen and kind of hydrogen infrastructure and hydrogen solutions. And I kind of fear that people don't really realize what is that going to mean, and they just buy into this green hype, and there is going to be horrible disappointments at some points. Have you seen examples of that? That yes, the locals are involved, but I'm not saying that they are directly lied to, not at all, but perhaps the projections are way too optimistic, and even we are not scientists, we are not exactly sure about the risks and the negative consequences, but so eager about the hype that perhaps we are moving too fast, and perhaps this discourse is overly optimistic, and somebody else is going to pay the price.
I that's a great question, and yes. And my experience has been largely in the food security realm, where that, for example, that containerized growing system that I showed, and these are being, again, like hyped as a cure for food insecurity in northern Canada, and these types of technologies come at a high cost for communities. It's an investment of an initial investment of between $500 and $1 million. And you think about a small northern remote community, $1 million is an incredible investment, and it's being promoted as a way to resolve your need to import fresh fruits and vegetables. Well, it hasn't come anywhere close to living up to those expectations. And what we see in these communities who do make these investments, it has a very deflating effect where you commit to making those types of financial investments, and at best it's producing a very small quantity of a select group of vegetables for community needs. And it's so, in my experience, it's been so defeating for the people who are really trying to do something positive in their communities. And I know that we're seeing more and more pushback from community members saying, you invested $1 million into this containerized growing, this hydroponic system that could have built 4 new homes for the people in our community. So you're seeing a lot of these interventions are then bringing a lot of local political conflict within communities and creating tensions that didn't necessarily exist before. But I think your point is dead on. The expectations right now are greater than the realities. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's actually something within our organization we've been sort of asking ourselves as well, when we're making these like 3-year, 5-year type projects, that this will lead to something really good. What is the 10-year, 20-year, 30-year expectation? Who will be benefiting, or what is the risk involved in some of these? And regarding this like vertical farming, indoor farming concept, I do know of an organization, a company here in Finland, there are quite a few of them actually, who are trying to make the whole process cheaper and less water dependent. And they have a technology where they are just spraying the roots of the plants, spraying the roots with a very, very, well, like just keeping them in a mist, basically. And as one of the owners of this type of development company told me, the first positive sign is that his increase in the amount of lettuce he's been eating that year was almost exponential because there was nobody else to eat what he was growing. But that's a bit of an aside. But actually, one of the slides you showed, David, related to the decision support tool and the this Nexus portal. I noticed that there were some questions in the chat related to the portal, and I hope, or I think, Nora, you had already put the one of the was it a website where people could get access here? Yes, it's already in the system. Okay, but when thinking about this type of these tools, how do you think we can ensure that these technologies are even accessible? I think it was the slide with the landscape, David. If we go, I think a previous. That's the portal, and the one before that.
Okay.
That one.
Yeah.
I know this is just a visualization, but this, if they were, I mean, to have all of these technologies, or some of the technologies, would they be available?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, something we really struggled with. And I'm less concerned about the serious game, just because I think the developers of this take into account different levels of capacity that are going to be needed to play it. My lingering concern is the porthole and the this decision support tool. And we, in developing this, we did a lot of research into, we're not the first group to come up with a decision support tool. And we looked at many others, and the criticism of those is that the technological capacity needed to really navigate these systems far exceed those in communities and the people who would benefit most.
So we digital divide, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And uploading data, running scenarios, different file formats. And I fear in many ways we did exactly what we said we weren't going to do. In that we let the technology drive the process. And we did a number of feedback sessions where we had government officials and community representatives navigate the system, tell us, okay, I'm lost, I don't know what to do here, you need to improve this. And we did our best to build in that feedback, but I still think it's a real challenge to actually to use these decision support tools in a way that we certainly thought would be most useful. I do think, at least from what we've seen, it's been effective for government planners to come in and try to navigate these systems, who have data, who could begin thinking about these scenarios. But a small community, Pawn Inlet, or some Old Crow Yukon, I don't know if it's going to be real valuable for those users because of the technology required, the capacity required for the technology. So we're going to continue to kick this can and see if we can't figure out a way that's more accessible. And that's actually was one of the motivations for the game, because in many ways it's the same outcome, get people thinking about the implications of decisions they make. And I do have confidence in the game that it's going to be very accessible and create that kind of nexus thinking that we're trying to promote.
Yeah, I think why I went to that one, simply the visualization of it, and that if you need to get a message across, I thought that maybe that would, and maybe this decision support tool also would work if you have, for example, different scenarios where local needs are going to change in one particular direction, and then to show what the demands would be under different environmental conditions is basically my point.
Right.
Do you think that the decision makers could actually use this type of tool for that type of thing? Or
Yeah, I'm hoping. And,
Mm.
in one case where we've piloted this as a nation I work with and they were dealing with both hydroelectric development and wind energy. And that we were able to build into these scenarios how the placement of these two energy projects would impact the harvest of one fish from the hydroelectric project, but also moose from the wind project, because we know exactly how much wild food is harvested from those areas, so we can estimate how that infrastructure will displace those resources. So community members got a very clear indication. It's not going to be exact, but they know that if we want to enhance our renewable energy options, we're going to have to accept that there could be a significant loss of our wildlife harvesting, actually in volume of food. So it's a at the very least, it's a more informed understanding about these types of trade-offs.
Mm.
And when we piloted with this community, and it's a small Cree community, it made perfect sense and it was accessible. Whether they use it when we leave the community, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, but as they say, time will tell on this type of thing, and you only need a small group to be highly motivated in any community, and then it may well move forward. I also wanted just to ask about the education initiatives that you had shown. I mean, do you think, or I mean, I guess you hope there will be an uptake for these types of open platform courses, but do you think it'll really have an effect in assuming people go for it? Will there be local educators, for example, interested in developing and making these types of courses even more local, for example?
Yeah, I think so. I think for the communities we work with, I think they're surprised that it's taken us this long to get to this point. Where again, the indigenous communities I work with don't necessarily think in such siloed ways, whether this is water, soil, wildlife. These are all interconnected systems. So to think about trying to manage them in any other way, or manage human actions in any other way, doesn't make a lot of sense to them. My personal motivation for developing the curriculum was to begin to chip away at some of the redundancy within government institutions. And I think that's still one of our biggest challenges in this project, is working with multi-government agencies who often have duplicating or competing interests in the management of these systems. And our work in the Yukon River Basin and the Peace River Basin is a perfect example of how there's so many government agencies who are all invested in these regions, whether it's energy, wildlife, water, who don't necessarily talk to each other and often compete for budget allocations. So many of our graduate students at the University of Saskatchewan go on and take government jobs. Whether or not this is going to be some life transforming experience in this class, that I don't know, but if we begin to change the culture at some level of how these institutions function within government, and when they begin to thinking about the interactions, government's big, and oftentimes they come in and they're just put in an existing hole in a peg in a hole, and don't have an opportunity. But if we begin to change the way we think about these systems when they're students, and they begin to take on these more influential roles with government and potentially industry, maybe there's a way that we could begin thinking about these systems in more complex ways, and to get away from the reactionary process around problem solving and begin anticipating problems and challenges within these systems. That's a big hope, and it's a big wish, but I think we have to begin somewhere. And if my building right now in the College of Agriculture, we have soil science, animal science, plant science, then we in ag economics are put off to the side. But we educate our students in such a siloed way. I think those barriers have to get broken down in a way, and particularly if we want to communicate with communities who don't necessarily think in terms of soil, plants, food.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and we can point the finger at ourselves in our institute as well, and knowing that we are sort of rather well segregated like that. And even, for example, the World Bank are now talking in terms of landscapes rather than talk about like human action or agricultural forestry, but the whole landscape, and that includes the soil, the water, the everything. Very good. Well, that I think, David, is all of the questions that I would like to pose to you. I'm relieved to see at least one hand up here. Please, if you could put your camera on and speak. All I can see are the initials.
May I
RB.
just interrupt briefly that I will stop the recording.
I hope
yeah, please.
Okay.
You stop the recording then, Nora.
Yes.
Thank you.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah.